This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everybody. It's Briana Whitney and Morgan Lowe. And I have had so many people reach out to me. Messages, Facebook posts, texts asking what is happening with the zombie hunter trial. And it's been going on this whole time. The only reason we hadn't done some updates was because we've had a slew of different testimony from doctors, things like that. And we were waiting for specific testimony from Bryan Patrick Miller's ex-wife for us to do a podcast update. And we just got that last week, and it was wild testimony. So we're going to break that down. But Morgan, you've been covering this a little bit in these months since we did a podcast update, which was last in early January. So it's been a little over 2 months. Obviously, this trial completely unlike most that we see. So what's been happening in that time frame? Who's been testifying, and where do we stand? Because this trial started in October 3rd. And we're now heading into mid to late March.
Right. It is going on and on and on. So when we first left the podcast listeners, the defense had started to make their case. And they had started with some witnesses that were friendly to Bryan Patrick Miller and helped them make their case. And then we went for about, I think it was 3 to 4 weeks of testimony from the psychologist, Dr. Cunningham. And this was, I'm sure, very important to the trial process, but it was tough to listen to because it was just technical, psychological details that really weren't of huge interest to a podcast audience, at least in our opinion. Important to the case, but to give you an idea of what sort of detail they went into, they spent, I think, 4 days establishing that Bryan Miller was autistic.
Wow.
And just, what type of tests were applied and that kind of thing. So the defense was meticulously, point by point, making its case and spent this entire time making their case that Bryan Patrick Miller suffers from mental disorders and that he therefore should not be held accountable for the murders that took place. They also, they had a couple of character witnesses, and then when the defense rested, I'm going to put an asterisk next to saying the defense rested their case, because they rested their case with the caveat that they could bring more witnesses forward. So they pseudo-rested their case, and then now we're into prosecutors doing rebuttal, where they are bringing witnesses back and going over some of the issues that the defense went over. And when this part's done, the defense will likely then bring up their rebuttal witnesses to what the prosecutors were talking about. So prosecutors brought a couple of the defense witnesses back and a couple of other witnesses just to clear up some points that they believed needed to be ironed out when the defense presented its case. And the prosecutors are also bringing forward psychologists, one court-appointed psychologist who examined Miller, and her conclusion was that Miller was not legally insane at the time of the murders. And that took a few days. That was interesting testimony, but nothing like we just heard. And as Briana said, this is the part of the trial where we as viewers of the trial perk up, because this is really, really interesting testimony.
Yeah. So there was really nobody who probably knew Bryan Patrick Miller better than his ex-wife, Amy. And when I tell you guys, I was listening to this testimony in the newsroom and audibly kept going like, What? I could not believe some of the things I was hearing, whether it was shocking, whether it was disturbing, whether it was something I didn't expect to hear. And that isn't always what we get in testimony, just like you said. Sometimes it can be, a little dull to the everyday person.
Yeah.
So I think this really sets up what Bryan Patrick Miller was like behind closed doors to the all of us who didn't get to see anything but the zombie hunter, right? And we know that's like this fantasy character that he played at one point that he loved, but maybe it wasn't also fantasy based on what we learned. So we're going to break this down. Amy took the stand last Thursday, and I think one point to note here is both Amy and Bryan were very religious. Bryan was part of the Mennonite church. Amy was also very religious, and she made it a point to say she did not believe in sex before marriage, that she really stayed true to that, and that they only one time had sex before they got married, but it was after they got engaged. And she brought up a lot throughout her whole day of testimony about how she viewed her job and her role as a wife to Bryan Patrick Miller. And I think that plays a big part in what you're about to hear. So listen to how she described that aspect.
God created marriage, and it was my job to live up to his expectations of a wife in a marriage. What the husband wanted is what the wife was supposed to do.
So clearly she took kind of a passive, almost submissive role to Bryan. And that will come up in how things, let's say, escalate between the two of them sexually. She describes finding out about when Bryan Patrick Miller was charged and convicted with stabbing Celeste when he was a teenager. That's when he went to juvenile detention. She said she didn't think much of it because he did describe Celeste looking like his mom, and that triggered him because of abuse from his mom when he was younger. So they moved on from there. They got engaged New Year's Eve heading into 1997. And eventually they wed, and then they moved to Washington State from Phoenix. Now, it was in Washington when we know that Bryan's violent path continued. We know there were multiple attacks there. One of them was on Melissa Ruiz Ramirez, and he was in jail until he was acquitted for that crime in self-defense. But after he got out of jail, that's when Amy said everything really ramped up and changed. His demeanor, his sexual fantasies, the things he expected her to do. And this is when I feel like the testimony took that shocking turn. Bryan started printing out specific porn. I'm going to use the word specific because it's not just regular porn. Would print it out, put it around their apartment, and also engaged in showing her it online in like a digital format. And Amy said it made her uncomfortable, but she did whatever Bryan wanted her to do. The prosecutor then asks her what type of porn this is and what she saw, and she describes that to the court.
At some point, it's very violent sexual situations.
Were any of the images that had throats being cut?
Yes.
Were any of the images of women being killed?
Yes.
Now here's the other thing about the porn. Amy said Bryan asked her to make a porn binder for him, to organize it into sections, like a 3-ring binder as somebody would make for a school, like a school class. And Amy said they did not use that porn binder in their own sex life, that was a request from her husband for him, not for Amy, and she did it. She found it a little odd, but she went ahead and did it. Now, that's not to say their own sex life didn't become ramped up too. This is really the part where I was just beside myself listening to this testimony live. Me and another investigative reporter were texting about what we were listening to at the time, and I think she used the word, "this is sick," and oh my gosh. And then I texted her saying, I can't believe what we're listening to. It's because the sex life between Amy and Bryan became violent and downright scary. Take a listen.
It began to involve a lot more bondage and things to induce pain. Earliest on, there were small knives. Later, after release, that included straight pins as well. He would use straight pins to stab into my breasts, through my nipples, and around my genitals and my lips.
Whose idea was that?
Yes. I know he expressed that he enjoyed seeing me in pain.
When you would bleed, what would he do?
He would both lick the wounds and play in the blood. He stated at one point, and eventually got to where he fairly commonly would state that if he didn't love me so much, he would like to kill me.
Did that comment impact your willingness to argue with him, say no to him, that kind of thing?
Very much. I would have been scared to object.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's hard to even know where to start to dissect all of that. I mean, very, very clearly, she did not object to any of what was going on because she was quite literally scared for her life if she said no. And I think that was a point in the court where it felt very heavy because you knew that this woman who was sitting there testifying in front of Bryan Patrick Miller himself feared for her life in these crazy sexual positions. And the blood part is really what got me. I mean, he would make her bleed so he could lick it and play in it. I mean, that is just heinous. It's awful. And I can't believe that we even sat there and listened to what would happen. But there's so much to unpack here. And Morgan, I want you to shine some light on a very specific situation. A lot of what Amy described there started by Bryan writing to her about crazy, violent sexual situations in letters from jail in Washington to her.
Right, what he wanted to do. And I'll tell you, you might have been cringing listening to that. I can guarantee that the defense attorney, the defense team was cringing listening to this because some of this is all disturbing, and it is certainly indicative of a completely dysfunctional relationship. However, some of it goes right to an assertion that the defense has made. So when Bryan Miller was in jail awaiting trial on the stabbing of Melissa Ruiz Ramirez, he was, as you said, he eventually was acquitted in that case. There were some questions about Melissa Ruiz Ramirez's background, and the jury, we spoke to a juror, and they just said they didn't have all of the information looking back, but they acquitted him. But he spent some time in jail. And while he was there, he was writing these letters to his wife, Amy. And some of them were describing what eventually he wanted to do with her. So we've got the letters showing that he wanted to do something and then him doing it. And why that's important is because if you think back on one of the main points that the prosecutors have made is that when Bryan was a late teenager, he wrote something they refer to as the plan. And it was the plan to kidnap, abduct a 17-year-old girl and to rape her and do all kinds of horrible things to her. The defense has referred to that in testimony as a work of fiction. It was a adolescent fantasizing, but it in no way was any indicator of what he wanted to do. The prosecutors have shown that and submitted that as evidence of an intent, of a plan to commit these murders. So Now they look at these letters and they say he wrote these letters to his wife, and they showed an intent, what he wanted to do, and then he did that with his wife afterwards. And they are, I am sure, trying to make the point to the judge that these are not works of fiction. When he was writing out saying he wanted to do something, it showed intent. And intent is a requirement for a first-degree murder charge. And he's on trial, first-degree murder. It's a capital case. First-degree murder is murder with homicide with malice, with a malicious intent. Malice aforethought is the phrase. So this is really important that they're going to compare these two, and I'm sure that that's going to come up in closings. But to me, that's really what stood out of that testimony. Not just the details of what he did, but the fact that he put it in paper and said, we want to do this, and then he went through with it.
And another point that I took away from it too was the topic of knives. We've spent a lot of these podcast episodes throughout the trial talking about how people have testified that Bryan was either afraid of knives, uncomfortable around knives, almost fearful of knives. Some people he knew have said that that went back to the abuse he suffered at the hands of his own mom, things like that. But Amy's testimony was clear as day that he, Bryan, chose to use knives in the bedroom. That was not Amy's choice, felt comfortable enough to do that. And clearly, I don't want to say, it turned him on, so to speak, but clearly he was interested in that and wanted that. And that brought him some sort of fantasy desire in real life. So was he afraid of knives? I mean, not in this context. And there was only one part in Amy's testimony when she said that she was hurt so badly that Bryan left the room because he's like, this is too much blood for me. But that was blood at his own hands. So I found that part to be pretty fascinating too, because we have spent so much time, at least looking at the defense, putting witnesses on the stand that say, well, Bryan would never be capable of killing Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness in that way because they were so brutally stabbed. He wasn't even comfortable around a regular kitchen knife. Yeah. Amy says otherwise.
And it's the question, it's which Bryan Miller? Is
right.
It the Bryan Miller that she described, that prosecutors describe, or is it the Bryan Miller that the defense has described, which is somebody who has problems but is not culpable for what he might have done because it was a psychological reaction to the abuse he suffered and the mental problems that he has. And that's what caused it. But the Bryan Miller who's sitting here, they say, is not the one who did that. May look like him, maybe the same person, but it's not that person that's here. And that's a really tough argument to make to a jury or a judge. And, this judge prosecuted capital cases. Suzanne Cohen she's been down this road before, maybe not as a judge in a bench trial, but that's a tough argument.
And I know you and I have been talking about this too. I mean, clearly the things we are hearing here, we might describe in everyday conversation as insane. But is it legally insane? Yeah. Does that mean he didn't know what he was doing at the time was wrong? It's almost two different things, right? I mean, it is insane to you and me, to our listeners, to people who are like, who could do anything like this? Even the stuff that is described by Amy. But I mean, it is a tough defense to prove he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. Yeah,
and that is a high standard and it's a high burden, but that's the route they are taking.
And a months-long route at that. Mm-hmm. So Amy obviously testified about their own lives together, but then she also talked about another victim, another attack that he confessed to her when they moved back to Phoenix after they had lived in Washington, about a woman he claimed he attacked on a running trail near their apartment. And I want you to listen to that sound.
Are you aware of something that happened in Washington?
Yes. He told me at that time that he had been the one to perpetrate that attack. That he had driven his car, parked it at the end around the corner from the trail, walked down the trail and hidden in the bushes waiting for someone to walk by. And when she did, he came out and had attacked her with a knife. She had said that he had actually stopped the attack when she had said to him, "Please, I don't want to die," or "Please don't kill me."
So basically she's saying he confessed to another victim, one that there was no charge for, one that we really hadn't heard of, or that police hadn't heard of or made that connection with Bryan yet. But that all points to who was a teenager named Victoria Michelson at the time. And Morgan, you actually went to Washington State and interviewed Victoria about this.
Yeah, we were there about a year and a half ago, and we spent about 3 hours with Victoria Michelson going over her recollection of what happened. She was 14 years old. It was the beginning of the school year, and she was walking to a friend's apartment along this trail, the interurban trail in Everett, Washington. And it was a little after 6 o'clock in the morning. And that is when she was attacked by somebody who jumped out of it's a very wooded area there. And this was a very big news story. This was a big event. We have the TV archives from the local channels there that covered it. It affected the community. She was a 14-year-old girl. She almost died, but she survived. But let's play some sound from that interview that we did with Victoria, and you can hear her describe what happened.
I looked over my shoulder and I saw a tall, dark shadow come out of the brush and onto the trail. And every time I turned around, his face just kept getting closer and closer. And he came up behind me and put his arm around both of my shoulders and got me in the neck. I got away from him somehow and I kicked the knife out of his hands. He said, "If you give me the knife, I won't hurt you." And he stabbed me twice in the back, and then he strangled me until I passed out. You cannot forget a face when it's buried in your memory that much. I wouldn't wish this recovery on my worst enemy. Phoenix police came up and said, "This is who I think it is." There's no doubt in my mind. His facial features and everything is spot on. There's no doubt in my mind, not a single question.
Victoria now believes that it was Bryan Miller who attacked her. But for years, this case was considered unsolved. And they had no idea. Originally, because of the location of the attack, was between a freeway and a homeless encampment, investigators believed that it was a homeless person who attacked her. The person was described as a very hairy face, tattoos on his hands. I don't know if they actually arrested somebody, but there were several persons of interest back then. Nobody was ever charged in the case, but police believed it was somebody from that encampment or some sort of transient from the roadway. This was linked to Miller because of Amy's testimony. And Phoenix police are the ones who went to Everett, Washington, and talked to Victoria and said, "Do you recognize this person?" She said, that's the guy. She recognized his face. Now, what Amy Miller has said was that one day Bryan came home and he shaved all the hair off his face. He shaved his beard, his mustache, and he looked totally different. Victoria said that he looked different, but the face, the eyes were the same. Now, what about those tattoos on the hands? Amy Miller testified that Bryan would doodle on his hands with a ballpoint pen. So it makes sense that maybe that was why she thought tattoos on the hands. And the final part of this story, which is pretty chilling, is that Bryan Miller lived about 100 yards from Victoria Michelson at that time. It was the same apartment complex a couple of buildings down. So when we were there, she would point to her door and then point up the road, and you could see where Bryan Miller lived. So that close. And this case is not, I mean, it's hard to say it's not considered solved, but Bryan Miller will not be prosecuted, even if police had enough evidence, because the statute of limitations for that kind of crime in Washington only lasts a certain amount of time, and it has run.
Which is so frustrating, I'm sure, for Victoria and everybody else.
And I asked her, I said, if he's convicted here, do you feel like maybe you've had some justice? And she said yes. But I will tell you, talking to her, what happened to her all those years ago when she was 14. I mean, this happened in the year 2000. Was it 2000 or two? Yeah, 2000. It was 2000. It still goes with her. She has the physical scars. I mean, she was cut with a knife, almost died. And she has the mental and emotional scars. She said the recovery from that attack took months and months. She had to go to school with a colostomy bag. I mean, forget a brutal attack, forget the stitches and the pain, the emotional pain of having to take a colostomy bag when you're a freshman in high school.
Right.
And that's one of the points she made is forget about all this stuff. Just that was horrible. And that was the least of it. So she really was an amazing person to have the courage to come tell her story. And she's had a rough life ever since then, but she's a survivor, and she was, making it work. But you could tell, we spent a couple hours with her, and wow, she had been through quite a bit.
And something that stuck out to me too when I was listening to Amy testify about this attack. I mean, Bryan told her about it only a few months after they moved back. Had Amy gone to police then with what Bryan told her, maybe there would have been a charge and a conviction in Victoria's case.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. Yeah, I mean, Amy knew that Bryan had said this, and I think it's worth noting here too that this is not the only confession Bryan allegedly made to Amy. She told Phoenix police about another girl that he confessed to killing at his door, who was grabbing money for a project and collecting money, and pulled her inside and killed her and then cut up her body and disposed of it. And Phoenix police, again, they believe Victoria, it was Victoria in that case. They believe in this case it was 13-year-old Brandy Myers because she lived in Bryan's neighborhood. She was collecting money for a school bookathon and disappeared, or the last place she was seen was 2 doors down from Bryan's home. So Phoenix police now believe there are at least 2 other victims that are almost guaranteed connected to Bryan Patrick Miller, and yet there haven't been charges in either of those cases. As far as Brandy's goes, it's the Maricopa County Attorney's Office that won't file those charges because they don't feel like there's enough evidence. Brandy was never found.
Yeah, no body.
No body, and they searched that house years later. I mean, I think viewers are wondering too, how did this all come to light? Well, this all came to light after Bryan was arrested for the Canal Murders in 2015. Brandy Myers went missing in 92, right before Angela Brasso was killed. Then you have Melanie Bernis. Victoria's case was in 2000. So there were so many years between when this information actually came out and when the crimes actually happened. And you have to think, if Amy had spoken up sooner about what she was told, what she knew from Bryan, would those 2 cases be solved?
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly in reading the transcript of Amy's talk with investigators after Bryan was arrested, she didn't really think that those actually happened. She thought it was more like fantasy. However, she lived in that area. When Victoria Michelson was attacked, she must have been aware that they were looking for an attacker. She must have been aware of, inconsistencies in maybe his story. It would be difficult, but obviously these people were living a type of life that I really can't connect to or we will never really understand. But it is very hard to believe that somebody in that position wouldn't have known that there was an attack and seen this change in her husband.
Yeah, I mean, if my husband or whoever shaved off his head right away out of nowhere, you might think something was up.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Is there anything else that our viewers, our listeners should know about the trial in these last couple months before we kind of say where we expect this to head?
Yeah, it's a lot of just you listen to what the defense is saying, and then you listen to what the prosecutors are saying, and it's, what are we going to believe? Are we going to believe the defense? Because the two, camps of psychologists who are testifying are basically saying the opposite.
There's psychologists on both sides testifying.
And they're basically saying, no, this is what you should believe about him, or no, this is what you should believe about him. So it's a tough position for a judge to be in, but at some point the judge, in this case, it's a bench trial, is going to believe one side or the other.
And that's to come. I know we're going to hear from more doctors. Amy is not done testifying. We should definitely say that too. We just don't know exactly when she's going to be back in court. I know we've said it in past episodes, but this trial is so unlike others. There's days where they're just randomly off, and now they're bringing in other people who are testifying before people who haven't finished testifying. It's kind of all over the place. And it's honestly hard for us to follow too in terms of coverage, just who's testifying on what day. But I know that the doctors are a heavy part of what's to come as well.
Yeah.
And is there anything else we should add on the
Yeah.
doctor front in a tangibly understandable way for our listeners?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked me that question. So I was looking through my notes here because I knew there was something. So one of these psychologists who testified, Leslie Dana Kirby, she was a clinical and forensic psychologist, but she was court appointed. And she had interesting points, obviously, for the prosecution, arguing that Bryan Miller was legally sane under the standard at the time of the murders. But she had some information that I had not really heard other places. She had really a rundown of his childhood and a rundown of his early life, and specifically the altercations and interactions that Bryan Miller had with the law. We knew that he had attacked Celeste Bentley when he was a teenager at the mall. But this psychologist started going back to Miller's time in Honolulu when he was 8 years old. He ran away from home. He allegedly started setting fires back then. Then he moved to Glendale, Arizona when he was 11. There's a Glendale police report of him setting a fire. He said that he had set that fire because of bad grades and he was getting in trouble at home. Phoenix PD, 1985, a shoplifting interaction with police. He left Smitty's with a toy, Smitty's supermarket. When he was 14, a curfew violation. When he was 15, criminal damage at Arizona Youth for Change, one of these organizations that was trying to help troubled youth. So we have a much more extensive list of problems with him dating back when he was younger. So this, the stabbing of Celeste Bentley wasn't something that came out of the clear blue. This was obviously a troubled child that had had a lot of interactions with police. And that is something that I didn't know about before. Yeah, and one other point here. The defense has really sort of made an argument that he's fairly like a docile, mentally, he had some real challenges in life, and that he wasn't this like overpowering type of person, very demure. But this psychologist talked about interviews that she had had with a couple of Bryan Miller's other girlfriends, and they referenced him in a different way. And one of the words that I can use that came out of this was angry, intelligent. These are words: angry, intelligent, and controlling. And I think that testimony was pretty damaging because it's if you listen to the defense, this isn't the kind of person who would be like that. he I'm not going to say it was barely functional, but had a lot of challenges in their point of view. And the prosecutors paint this, and I thought it was pretty successfully paint this image of him as a highly intelligent, that's a phrase they used, controlling and angry person. And that really stood out to me, that couple of days of testimony that I listened to.
That's interesting too, because if you couple the past girlfriends with what Amy said as well, you definitely see what appears to be a pattern of how he was, at least in his relationships, but also how he was with women. I believe the prosecution asked Amy why Bryan enjoyed watching people in pain, watching her in pain, the porn of violent situations. And her response was, he thought it was fun and it turned him on.
Wow.
That was her response.
Wow. It's pretty interesting. We are now, October, November, December, January. We are 5 months into this trial. And this testimony that we just discussed happened within the last 2 weeks. So listeners might say, why would we wait this long to hear this? Because the prosecution was done with their case at the end of November, I believe. But their case was very limited. They were only allowed to give evidence that pertained to the actual murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis. Then the defense came in and really started talking about all these problems that Bryan Miller had mentally and these things that happened to him. And what that did was open the door. They opened the door for the prosecutors now to say, well, we're going to bring in our expert that's going to give you a different point of view of him. And in doing so, we're going to introduce evidence of him getting arrested when he was younger. Other views of him where he's controlling, and those words that I used to describe that I heard from that testimony. And then we're going to interview or introduce and hear testimony from Amy, his ex-wife. And then she is allowed to bring in all of these, examples of her interactions with him. So that's why it's taken so long
Yeah.
to get to this.
And that is an interesting point. I mean, you do wonder what that means for the defense then if they were trying to build, what Bryan suffered with and all of that for their case, but then that does open the door for prosecution to then question those same people about those aspects. And does that help or hurt the defense truly in the end? I don't know. And I thought when Amy was testifying, not that it's unusual to hear this, but when the defense would object to things that the prosecutor was asking, most of the time it was overruled. It was not sustained. So therefore, Amy could go forward with what she was saying. And that opened another door or another can of worms for so much more detail than the defense, I assume, ever wanted out there.
Yeah, I mean, it was a calculated gamble on the defense. They're going down this path. They knew that by making these claims about his mental capacity and the things that happened to him before, that they were opening the door to this pretty damaging testimony. And I think that the last couple of weeks have been very effective for prosecutors to poke some holes in what the defense is saying. What I think has no bearing on the case, though, because it's the judge, and we're not going anywhere because this case is going to last at least, what do you think, Briana?
Through April.
Yeah,
I
at least
think
another month and a half.
Yeah, which is just crazy when you think about that. It started on October 3rd. I mean, we do expect capital cases to take some time. I've not seen a case take this long, and it is so not traditional. So it will be the judge that will make that verdict on guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity. That's what this all comes down to, is proving, the defense trying to prove that he didn't know what he was doing was wrong at the time, and so therefore he should be not guilty by reason of insanity.
And so what we have ahead of us is the prosecution is going to finish out with its witnesses. Maybe Amy's going to testify again. We think so. The defense will then have a couple of rebuttal or redirect, cross-examining some of these witnesses, or a couple of rebuttal witnesses of their own. And then the judge is going to hand down a verdict. The judge is going to decide guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity. And then, and we don't know how long that's going to take because
Right.
there's no jury waiting around. So it's not like the jury is, trying to come up with this answer. It might be a day, it might be a week, it might be a month. But once the judge renders that verdict, if it's not a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict, if it's a guilty verdict, then the penalty phase starts. And then we have all new witnesses or witnesses that we've heard from again speaking about him differently, because then it's going to be, all right, he's guilty. What do we do with him? And, the prosecutors are asking for the death penalty. It could be death down to, I'm not sure what the minimum is on a guilty of first-degree murder charge, but that'll be another sort of mini trial. And it might take place right after the verdict, or there might be a gap in there. We're not sure. And then there'd be a pre-sentence report potentially, or this hearing where we talk about, why the mitigating factors or aggravating factors. And then the judge would decide if the defendant goes to the death chamber or is just sentenced to life in prison or that range. But now, it's been a couple of years since this court ruling came down. The jury was supposed to make that decision. So then that would be that sort of penalty phase because it's a capital case. Now this is a bench trial. The judge is serving at the jury. But that is why now there's going to be this mini sort of penalty phase trial. And it's really aggravating factors versus mitigating factors. Aggravating factors, the prosecution will show why he deserves to be put to death. The mitigating factors, evidence of mental illness, child abuse, that sort of thing might mitigate what he did, and it'd just be a life sentence or a 40-year sentence or whatever the judge decides. I'm not sure what the range of possibilities are.
And that's the thing in this case. There are so many possibilities of the outcome of this case. The two verdicts have two completely different aspects on what could happen to Bryan Patrick Miller. And then beyond that, if you have the guilty verdict, there's a whole slew of options that could take place. So, and we've talked about too, we don't know if he's found not guilty by reason of insanity. There's a chance he goes to a mental facility and could get out at some point. So that's a whole nother aspect that we just don't quite know. And that could be based off of what laws were in the 90s when these crimes happened versus now in 2023.
Yeah.
I've never seen so many options on the table.
It's being tried under the not guilty by reason of insanity laws from the early 1990s. Now those have changed, and it is now called guilty but insane. But that's not what is... those aren't the laws that are being used because the murders took place back then. So they are going under that not guilty by reason of insanity.
Is it harder to prove that somebody is insane in this day and age versus then, or vice versa?
It's a different test that they use. It's a subtle difference, and I can't recite it right now, but there is a subtle difference. I do believe that the difference is not just semantics. I think there's a real difference there. But I couldn't tell you whether it's harder or easier.
Interesting. So now that we've probably thoroughly confused our listeners with all these possibilities, you can understand why we come with these updates to break it down for you, because there's so much here. And we'll continue to have these updates as there's more testimony from doctors, hopefully from Amy, other people. And then, of course, we're looking towards a verdict, hopefully in the next, month or two. We can bring you that verdict and then the fallout from the other side of that in terms of what happens to Bryan Patrick Miller. And also, too, I've been talking to some of our sources that we talked to for our special a year and a half ago on this and throughout the investigation. There are people who are now retired from the police department that have a whole lot they want to reveal and can't and could not until this trial ends. And they're going to also be coming on the podcast to share just so many more behind the scenes details and information. So we have a lot to come on Zombie Hunter and Bryan Patrick Miller. Thank you for listening and staying with us. We know this is the long haul because it is such a long trial, but you really won't find any better coverage of such a huge case than here on the True Crime Arizona podcast and on Arizona's Family. So thank you guys so much, and we'll see you for the next update. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney.
And me, Morgan Lowe. It is a production of 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.